So one of the things that's really important to remember as you watch all the craziness that goes on in the press, especially in the summer when they haven't got a lot of news, so they're just actually feeding off their own rage and stupidity. One of the things you have to remember is the same machinery that attacks President Trump, the same machinery that sells socialism, the same machinery that sells abortion, the same machinery also makes people famous and successful. It's the same machinery, right? You know, when you hear me go off on the New York Times and call them a former newspaper and make fun of them all the time, you're looking at a novelist who knows that he will never get a review in the New York Times again, let alone I'll probably never even get a bad review because they wouldn't go out of their way to give me that much attention. So you don't meet that many people. That doesn't make me a hero. That just means I have a different set of priorities than a lot of people have. And I'm a different age than a lot of people have. And I don't really care what the New York Times thinks about me. I don't think it's going to matter to me in the long run. But most people, especially young people, if they're up and coming and they're working in the business and they're working, even if they're writing nonfiction, if they're writing fiction, if they want to be in the movies, if they want to do all kinds of things, the same machinery that is selling you socialism, selling you abortion, selling you all the things that the Democrats want to sell you, selling you open borders, that same machinery is the machinery they need to become famous. So you have to understand that when you're seeing these character assassination wars that are going on right now, what you're seeing is this weapon that has been unleashed on us in a celebrity society, a society where any publicity is good publicity. You're seeing that machinery kind of going out of control. I mean, this happened with Ben last week. It was just appalling. This actor, what was his name? Mark Duplass, I think. He tweeted about Ben. He said, I don't agree with Ben. He was talking to his fellow liberals. He said, if you want to follow somebody on the other side, you might want to think about following Ben Shapiro. He said, I don't agree with him on much, but he's a genuine person who once helped me for no other reason than to be nice. He doesn't bend the truth. His intentions are good. All of which, by the way, is true about Shapiro. I don't like to blow his cover because I know he's got this big thing about what a bad guy he is, but it's true. He will go out of his way for you. He's incredibly generous. And he's even been generous to Knowles. You know, he only backed over him twice, I think, the last time. So, of course, they unleash on Duplass. And Duplass not only pulls down the tweet because he's protecting his profession, because the same machinery that he needs, right, to make him famous is the machinery that is selling all this socialist stuff. But not only does he pull the tweet recommending Ben, he then gets out and he says, basically he says that Ben is hateful. He says he's racist. You know all the stuff, sexist, racist, homophobic, all this stuff that Ben actually isn't. So he now throws Ben under the bus. Shapiro didn't call up Duplass and say, hey, could you recommend following me? And this assassination stuff is what goes on. You know, it happened to a judge, one of President Trump's nominees, a guy named Ryan Bounds. Tim Scott, who is a senator that I really respect. He's the only black Republican senator, and he seems like a good guy, a straight arrow guy, but he basically nixed a appeals court nominee, Ryan Bounds, because of stuff that Bounds wrote in college, where he said he thought it was wrong. He was complaining about multicultural organizations that divide up by race for their feel-good ethnic hoedowns. And he said, well, white students don't seem to need an Aryan student union. Why should there be a black student union? And Scott nixed him for that, which I think is wrong. Now, maybe, look, Scott is a good guy. Maybe he knew more than I know. I'm just telling you what I read in the papers and read in anti-Trump papers to make sure I was getting at all the worst stuff. But you should be able to say things in college and write things in college that maybe later on you change your mind about. And I don't personally think that's so bad, what he said. But even so, even if you didn't agree with it anymore, you've got to be able to explore ideas. You've got to be able to be wrong sometimes. Ben answered Duplass by putting out a thing on all the things that he had said that he regretted and all the things that he was attacked for that he didn't regret saying, because Ben knows too, Ben knows too that this machinery is very, very destructive. But the thing is, it's a way of arguing that we have all gotten used to. And this is really important. When somebody says something to me that I disagree with, I say, here's why I disagree with that. I don't say, oh yeah, well, I researched you, and back in college, you slept with a girl who'd had 5 drinks. That's not an argument. That is not an argument. When somebody says we should have socialism, it's not an argument to say, well, you slept with a drunk girl in college. When somebody says we should ban abortions, it's not an argument to say, oh, well, you once stole some money from a store. That's not an argument. And so the problem that the left has is they have this huge machinery and everything they think is untrue. Socialism destroys the economy. Abortion really is killing. I mean, you can make arguments for abortion, but you have got to accept the fact that you are killing what will be a full human being in time. This woke stuff is pure racism. Even so-called corrective racism is racism. And because all this stuff is true and open borders do increase crime and they're just insane because you need borders to have a country, all these things, their arguments are bad. So character assassination is what they've got, right? And so they've built this big machine that not only sells democracy, this socialism, not only sells anti-democratic means, not only sells abortion, not only sells open borders, it also sells publicity. It also sells favor. Let me show you it's almost hilarious. It would be hilarious if it weren't so awful. Brian Stelter is plugging The Handmaid's Tale. Now, you all know The Handmaid's Tale is this dystopian thing based on a novel. I read the novel. I haven't seen the show. I will tell you that the show is made in part by people I know and people I have worked with who I think are as talented as anybody in Hollywood, as talented and intelligent. I'm sure the show is good. I just didn't happen to like the novel, so I didn't watch the show. But they're selling this a dystopian show in which women have lost all their rights and they're forced to go around dressed like the flying nun in those big hats. I don't know what the point of those big hats are. Sally Field at least could fly around wherever the hell she lived as a nun, but I don't know why they're wearing these in this thing. But anyway, they wear these hats and they're forced to have babies, blah, 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 blah. Brian Stelter is promoting this as, in fact, the Handmaid's Tale people have promoted it as being an actual commentary on Trump's America. Just listen to a minute of this. It's unbelievable.
In the world of Trump, plot lines that were once thought to be too outlandish are no longer.
I would be very happy if my show became irrelevant as quickly as possible.
Bruce Miller is the creator of Hulu's breakout Emmy-winning series, The Handmaid's Tale. Conceived before the election, the chilling show went on to capture the lightning of the current political environment.
Our writers' room is very news aware. Trump pushing out all these hot button issues brings them to the fore and they become conversations in the writers' room.
Hard to fathom, since The Handmaid's Tale is a dystopian show set in a made-up place called Gilead, where women's rights have been stripped under a twisted totalitarian regime.
We don't do anything on the show that isn't happening to women somewhere in the world.
It feels like a cautionary tale more than ever.
What does it mean for this program to be on now in the Trump age?
It has far more meaning and urgency as we see women's rights, particularly women's reproductive rights, under attack yet again.
Unbelievable. Now, when he says that we don't do anything on the show that isn't happening to women somewhere in the world, I agree, but it's happening in the Muslim world, not this world, not the world that we live in, the lovely Western world that we live in, where women have any right you can imagine. There is an argument to be had about abortion that we were not allowed to have because the Supreme Court shut the political process down with Roe v. Wade. There's an argument to be had about abortion. It is not just about a woman's right. It is also about the baby's right. There's another person involved. That's not The Handmaid's Tale that people want to debate abortion. It's insane. But let me just tell you how this works, all right? The people who make this show, they want the show to succeed. They want people to watch it. They want to garner an audience. Of course they do. I want audiences for the things I do. We all do. They can go on Brian Stelter. Brian Stelter focuses on the news if they have a news hook. Back in the 80s, I wrote what I think is a really good crime story called A Shock to the System, starring Michael Caine. It was based on the excellent, excellent novel by Simon Brett. And I used it in part, not as an attack on Ronald Reagan, but as a commentary on the Reagan age of people where they said greed is good. Okay. And the only point of the show is basically capitalism needs moral limits. That was kind of the point of the thing. But that was the theme. It's really just a murder story, right? That was the theme was that, like, this guy just takes success. Even the desire for success needs moral limits. So that was kind of the theme. But the story is a murder story. The New York Times called me up. And at the same time, there was a movie called, oh gosh, I cannot remember. It was teenagers in a high school who start killing people. And it was coming out at almost exactly the same time. It had a one-word title. Can't remember. A guy from the New York Times calls me up and he says, what is the meaning of this trend where movies are about murder? And I'm still to this day a very naive teller of truth. When you ask me a question, I tend to tell you the truth, right? And so I said, I don't think it's a trend. That's ridiculous. So they didn't quote me, and they didn't promote the movie, right? And of course, I learned from that. Today, I would have said something to try and get the movie promoted, because that was my job. I didn't understand. I thought when people asked you something, you told the truth. I still feel that way. It's still the first thing that comes out of my mouth when people ask me a question is what I think is the truth. But still, that was not playing to the machine. All right, so now we're in the position. So now we have this guy, James Gunn. And James Gunn is at the top of the Hollywood food chain. He's directing The Guardian of the Galaxy. I think he wrote and directed the first one, and now he was directing number 3. So this alt-right guy, what's his name? Michael Cernovich, right? And he's the real, they call everybody alt-right. They probably call me alt-right at this point. But Michael Cernovich is a really alt-right guy. And he goes after him, and he digs up all these tweets that Gunn made about rape and pedophilia, and Disney dumps him, okay? So, and by the way, Gunn had called for boycotts of Laura Ingraham, so he was being hoisted on his own petard. The machine that the left created was turned against him. And a lot of right-wingers said, well, good, turnabout is fair play. And some right-wingers who were more thoughtful kind of wrung their hands about it and said, do we want to get in this game where we stop arguing? See, we have good arguments. We have arguments for freedom. We have arguments for prosperity. The stuff we do works. The stuff we believe in, it dignifies people and uplifts people. And yeah, there are all kinds of arguments within the conservative community and arguments between conservatives and reasonable liberals that can be had, all kinds. But still, our arguments tend to make life better, as we see under Trump, where the economy is soaring. So we tend not to try to character assassinate people. But the problem I have with Gunn, and I'm holding fire on Gunn. If all he did was make jokes, I don't think he should be fired. I don't think anybody should be fired for making jokes. I make all kinds of jokes. You have heard me preach it about racism, how I think it is an absolute attack on God. I think racism is an attack on God. I also believe in making racial jokes. I believe you should joke about everything. That's part of how you expel some of the hostility, natural craziness that people have. I think it's a great thing. All right. But I'm holding fire on Gunn because Hollywood has a pedophilia problem, and that is what we're bringing on Knowles to talk about after the break. I want to talk about the fact that this is a problem in Hollywood, and every time it comes up, it gets squelched, and it gets squelched fast, and that is because powerful people are involved. So I'm holding fire judgment on Gunn, what Disney knew about him, what they didn't know. His tweets were really ugly, not funny. I don't know why there are so many jokes about pedophilia, but we'll talk to Knowles about that when he comes on. But the thing I want to emphasize is the idea that this is new under Trump is ridiculous. And the idea that the left cares about character is absurd. Over the weekend, I watched Chappaquiddick. I finally got to see Chappaquiddick, which was good. And I think it's made by lefties who are attacking Teddy Kennedy from the left. But it's pretty journalistic, right? They don't say what they don't know. They don't say that Teddy Kennedy was having an affair with Mary Jo Kopechne. They make it just a little bit blurry. You just don't know. But he obviously knew her. He was obviously a heavy drinker. He was obviously a guy who cheated on his wife a lot, drove off the cliff, left her there. She might have survived if he had reported it. His friends told him to report it. He said he would report it, and he didn't. And they follow that. And they also follow how the Kennedy machine gathers around him to help basically squelch this thing in the hope that one day Teddy Kennedy can still run for office. Here's a brief scene. It's cut number 9, where all these famous guys from the John F. Kennedy administration get together to help Teddy strategize how to cover up the clearly illegal manslaughter of this woman.
We need to remind the American people what this family has been through.
And how are you planning on doing that, Ted?
We tell the truth, or at least our version of it. Now, I followed mine the best I could that night, and me and Paul and Joe, we did everything we could to save that poor girl.
So they basically engineer. He never made it to the presidency, but he did get reelected forever to Congress, to the Senate in Massachusetts, where he used his position to assassinate the character of Robert Bork. Robert Bork was an originalist constitutional judge whom Ronald Reagan appointed as nominated to be a justice of the Supreme Court. And Teddy Kennedy led the assassination of this character to the point where it became known as borking. It was called borking. Here is a moment of Teddy Kennedy borking Robert Bork.
In Robert Bork's America, there is no room at the inn for blacks, and no place in the Constitution for women, And in our America, there should be no seat on the Supreme Court for Robert Bork. Mr. Bork has been equally extreme in his opposition to the right to privacy. In an article in 1971, he said, in effect, that a husband and wife have no greater right to privacy under the Constitution than a smokestack has to pollute the air. What I hear you're saying here now is that the test that was used about 90 years ago, and which was the basis for discrimination against women, is the standard that you would use. You may be able to elaborate on it, but that's at least what I'm hearing.
It was appalling. I mean, by the end of it, they were saying, well, Bork had tried pot in college. How could you serve on the Supreme Court when you had violated the law? You know, that was the kind of thing they did. This was a really fine justice, and he was destroyed by these guys. It was appalling. And here is a guy who drove this woman off a bridge, left her there, went home to establish an alibi. There's no question that he did this, that Teddy Kennedy did this. And it looks like the people who found her said it looked like she did not drown in the car. She suffocated as the air ran out of the air bubble in the car, and it may have taken her as long as 25 minutes, which meant if he had gotten out, run to the nearest house, called the police, she might have been saved. I mean, it's an appalling, appalling story. Here is just some clips from our friends at Newsbusters of how the news handled the death of Teddy Kennedy. Listen to this.
We're going to begin something. Can you see this going by? It is a scroll, and it's going to continue. We will not finish it before we take a break, because it's Senator Kennedy's legacy, 46 years of service, 300 bills passed.
If you're in a wheelchair, that ramp is thanks to Ted Kennedy. If you earn the minimum wage, you make more because of Ted Kennedy.
The heavens were weeping for Teddy Kennedy today.
They forgot to mention if you find yourself suffocating in a car, that's because you can thank Ted Kennedy as well. My point is this, right? The character assassination machinery and the machinery that sells Democrats' version of America, the socialism, the America is always wrong, the open border, the abortion, this is the same machine. It is the same machine, and it has zero moral authority. And if people cannot stand up to that machine, if people are so ambitious, if they're so eager for good publicity, if they just are so desperate to have an acting career or a directing career, they can't stand up to that machine, then you have a machine for the destruction of conservatives, the destruction of conservatism, and the destruction of anyone who stands up against the Democrat deep state. I mean, that is what you have. And that's what we're seeing. And that is why it's kind of, that's why it's really hard for me to attack Trump, even when he does things I don't like, because I understand that Trump as a celebrity understands the machine and is using his celebrity to fight back against it. He's using essentially the same methods that they use on everybody else. And so like over the weekend, they released, it was Friday, they have these Friday news dumps. They finally released this FISA warrant that they've been trying to pry out of the FBI, and they redacted almost everything. But the fact was, it showed that when they asked for the ability to spy on Carter Page, a guy who had not been with the Trump campaign for months by the time they started spying on him, they said, oh, we have evidence that he was, that he was colluding with the Russians, and they used this Steele dossier, this stuff that was Russian propaganda bought and paid for by the DNC and Hillary Clinton. And they didn't say, they said, well, it may have been collected, in a footnote, they say it may have been collected by people trying to get, Oppo research on Donald Trump. But that could have been anybody, right? That could have been one of his, it could have been Ted Cruz. It could have been anybody. They did not say its provenance. And they basically lied. It was just a mistake. And this actually does justify what Devin Nunes said was happening when he and his committee released that report saying this was unfair. So now they're seizing on the fact that there was this footnote to say, oh, this disproves everything the Republicans say. One of the most dishonest news pieces I have ever seen, and that is saying a lot, it was in the front page of the New York Times. They call it news analysis. Now, everybody who reads the New York Times with open eyes knows that news analysis means an editorial that we're putting on the front page. Even by that standard, this was incredibly dishonest. This is Charlie Savage writing this piece about this FISA warrant. And I don't want to get into the deep weeds about it, but he says when President Trump declassified a memo by House Republicans in February that portrayed the surveillance of a former campaign advisor as scandalous, his motivation was clear. It was to give congressional allies and conservative commentators another avenue to paint the Justice Department's investigation into Russian election interference as tainted from the start. But this past weekend, Mr. Trump's unprecedented decision, which he made over the objections of law enforcement and intelligence officials, had a consequence that revealed his gambit's shaky foundation. The government released the court documents in which the FBI made its case for conducting the surveillance, records that plainly demonstrated that key elements of Republicans' claims about the Bureau's actions were misleading or false. You have to get like 12 paragraphs down. I lost count of how many paragraphs you get down before you find out that everything in the Republican memo was true. You have everything. And it's just, he goes on and on and on before you get down to the bottom thing. And Adam Schiff, who, as I say, is playing by the Joe McCarthy handbook, no question about it. Adam Schiff is still just throwing these charges out at Trump. Play the Adam Schiff clip just to show this is embarrassing. If this isn't what Putin wants people doing, I don't know what is.
Well, I certainly think he's acting like someone who's compromised, and it may very well be that he is compromised, or it may very well be that he believes that he's compromised, that the Russians have information on him. We were not permitted to look into one of the allegations that was most serious to me, and that is, were the Russians laundering money through the Trump Organization? The Republicans wouldn't allow us to go near that. I hope that Bob Mueller's investigating it, because again, if that's the leverage the Russians are using, it would not only explain the president's behavior, but it would help protect the country by knowing that, in fact, our president was compromised.
You got to play Trey Gowdy's response about Russian collusion. This is hilarious. Gowdy said there's no evidence of Russian collusion. Listen to this.
I have not seen one scintilla of evidence that this president colluded, conspired, confederated with Russia. And neither has anyone else, or you may rest assured Adam Schiff would have leaked it. So that's why they've moved off of collusion onto obstruction of justice, which is now their current preoccupation.
So if he had the evidence, Schiff would have leaked it. I mean, that's pretty good. So the point I'm making is always remember, if you make The Handmaid's Tale, and I'm not saying the show's no good. Like I said, it's made by some of the most talented people I've met out here. If you make The Handmaid's Tale, you go on Brian Stelter and say it's about Trump, you get the publicity you need, you get the audience you want. If you're Ben Shapiro and you get slimed, you're pretty much on your own. I mean, we will stand up for Ben because we know who he is, but Brian Stelter ain't going to do it. The New York Times is not going to do it. ABC, NBC, CBS are not going to do it, because the machine is all on one side, and it's the same machine that both slanders and creates the success that a lot of people are looking for.